Krivax could feel his exhaustion grow worse as he read through the reports detailing the ongoing war. More specifically, the exhaustion that had been creeping up on him over the past few months grew worse when he read about the demonstrable effect that his actions were having on the course of history. Originally, the Horde would have used the red dragons that they had enslaved to push back the Alliance fleet, and the fact that this had not happened was obviously something that Krivax was happy about, but his efforts had not been quite as successful as he had hoped. The Horde still managed to find some dragons, although ones that were markedly less alive than they were in canon, and land their troops in Hillsprad foothills. Not only that, but Dalin Proudmoore had been seriously maimed and had even lost a limb. While the Alliance had come out ahead by not losing as large a portion of their navy, they had still lost one of the most experienced naval minds in the Eastern Kingdoms. It would take quite a while before they could stick a peg leg on Proudmoore, heal him up, and send him back out to sea. It was at times like this that Krivax wished that he had been reincarnated into a bronze dragon. His life would be much easier if he could freely see the effect that his actions would have on the future. For the most part, Krivax had felt that he had gotten extremely fortunate in how his actions had turned out for him so far. But this was a stark reminder that his decisions could have unanticipated consequences, and the forces he was working against would not simply lay down and fail to adapt. All of this would be easier if I wasn't so weak. In truth, Krivax was not weak at all. But that was only when you took his age into account. In between his politicking and scheming, Krivax had not let up in his magical studies for even a moment, but it was simply not enough. Azeroth was a death world in which the main antagonists were generally extremely powerful creatures that had been around for millennia. Deathwing, and the other aspects, were so old that Krivax didn't even have a good way to estimate how long they had been around, despite his meta-knowledge. In addition to that, they had all been empowered by cosmic entities powerful enough to destroy worlds with little effort. Compared to Krivax, Deathwing was so powerful that he might as well be a god. Even Hadix, as unexpectedly powerful as he was showing himself to be, would not last for more than a few moments when faced with Deathwing's true power. When the difference between him and his enemies was so great, Krivax found it difficult to see how he could possibly become powerful enough to affect the fate of Azeroth. Of course, he did have a few ideas about how he could drastically increase his power. There were many extremely valuable secrets in this world that Krivax was privy to, after all. However, Warcraft as a franchise tended to gate powerful artifacts or magical items behind equally powerful defenses. Power always came at a price, and Krivax was reluctant to risk his life to acquire it. He wasn't particularly interested in becoming some super powerful being. His greatest dream was to simply be able to explore the beauty of Azeroth without having to worry about himself or the people he cared about being killed. But Krivax couldn't help but feel like he wasn't as close to achieving that dream as he wished he was. Most of his days were now filled with diplomacy, politics, and worrying about insane dragons trying to destroy the world. Was this how his life was going to be from now on? After Deathwing was dealt with, was he just going to move on to worrying about the Lich King next? It was all just starting to feel incredibly exhausting. Maybe I should just take a risk? Would it be worth it to risk my life trying to gain more power if it meant that I could live more freely? Krivax wasn't certain what the correct answer to that was, but it was a question that had been on his mind more and more lately. However, there was nothing he could do about it in the short term, so he forced himself to push these thoughts aside for now. The Second War was still raging and Deathwing was still an active threat that needed to be dealt with. All that was left to him was to use his meta-knowledge to position the good guys in the best position possible to improve the future. And it seems like I'll get a chance to do that soon, Krivax thought with grim satisfaction. Crossus had finally returned to Dalaran, and Krivax would make certain to point him straight at Davil Presta. Most of his time since he had informed Hadix about the current situation had been spent assisting Stormwind in gathering evidence. Hadix had assisted by investigating the potential victims for mental influences and had managed to detect faint traces of the void that Stormwind had missed. Krivax was the one who would be presenting all of this evidence to Dalaran, and he had every intention of incriminating Davil Prester as much as possible. After causing so much trouble, he only wished that he could have the chance to see the look on Deathwing's scaly face when he realized that his human disguise had been discovered and the aspects would be all gathered to tear him to pieces. Krivax was not usually a particularly vindictive person, but he felt like Deathwing was someone who he could make an exception for. He only hoped that, unlike in canon, they actually managed to finish Deathwing off so that he couldn't come back to cause problems in the future. Krivax cast a convenient spell that he had learned recently that would tell him the current time and discovered that it was nearly time for his meeting. The Council of Six would not normally gather just because they were asked to, but Azrael Nerub was simply too powerful and important to the ongoing war effort for them to decline. Honestly, despite this not being his first time meeting with them, Krivax was feeling a bit nervous. This was the first time that he was trusted enough to meet with such powerful figures without having his hand held by one of his superiors. He had earned that trust by handling Azrael Nerub's affairs with only minor slip-ups. Although, I suppose it helps that there aren't many Nerubians who are particularly interested in doing what I'm doing. He really didn't want to ruin all of his hard work by making a fool of himself in front of the Council of Six. Krivax spent the next few minutes going over what he intended to say while also preparing his scrying tools. Although the Council of Six had granted him an audience, there was no convenient way for them to hold it in person. Many of the archmages were incredibly busy with their own affairs due to the war and were not currently in Dalaran. Once he was done preparing himself, Krivax took a deep breath and cast the necessary spell to connect him to the Council of Six. Fortunately, it seemed like the archmages had been waiting and none of them were interested in wasting their time. Soon enough, Krivax was looking at the images of 5 archmages, with the only missing member being Kel'Thuzad. That was fine with him, the only one that he truly cared about was Crossus. "Greetings, Vizier Krivax," Antonidas immediately said once the scrying connection was made. Krivax had a feeling that the Grand Magus wanted to get the meeting over with as quickly as possible. "I apologize for Archmage Kel'Thuzad's absence, but he had important prior commitments and was unable to join this meeting." "It's not a problem, Grand Magus. I understand that you are all very busy," Krivax said politely. "I'm grateful that you were all so willing to accept Azrael Nerub's request for a meeting despite the ongoing difficulties of the war." "Well, you all certainly made it sound important," Archmage Modera replied dryly. "But you are correct that we are quite busy, so let's get to the heart of the matter. Why have you called for this meeting? Is there an issue with our ongoing trade agreement with Azrael Nerub?" It was becoming increasingly obvious with every report that came from the front lines that beasts being provided by Azrael Nerub were well worth the price that the Alliance had paid for them. Krivax wasn't surprised that they would be the first thing that the archmages would think about. "No, as I informed Archmage Runeweaver in our most recent meeting, Azrael Nerub is completely capable of providing the beasts throughout the war, despite the high rate of attrition," Krivax assured the council. "Then what is the subject of this meeting?" asked Prince Kael'thas. "I've called this meeting to bring a matter to your attention that affects the interests of both Azrael Nerub and Stormwind," said Krivax. Although he wasn't able to read their body language, Krivax had no doubt that his words had aroused the interest of the archmages. "I was not aware that Azrael Nerub and Stormwind were on friendly enough terms that you feel comfortable speaking for them," said Crossus with barely concealed suspicion. "We were not until we recently became aware that we were both being targeted by the same malicious actors," said Krivax, ignoring the dragon's tone. "Prince Varian presented us with convincing evidence that someone has been using magic to manipulate the minds of the nobility against our kingdoms. Stormwind even believes that these people are the reason why nobody was willing to respond to their requests for aid when they were fighting against the Horde." There was a stunned silence among the council before Archmage Modera spoke up. "That is ludicrous. We would have certainly noticed such widespread manipulation. What you are proposing would only be possible for a mage far more powerful than any single member of this council or an organization of renegade mages that would have not escaped our notice. Who do you claim is responsible for this, and what evidence do you have?" Krivax didn't get upset by the Archmage's fervent denials. He hadn't exactly expected to receive a warm response when he was basically telling the Council of Six that they had failed so badly at their job that an entire human kingdom had been destroyed because of it. He was practically insulting them all to their faces. According to the evidence provided by Stormwind, we believe that House Prester is primarily Respawn. Who? I've never heard anything about a House Prester in my life, said Archmage Modera, interrupting Krivax's explanation. Do you truly expect this council to believe that some no-name noble house in the middle of nowhere was able to use magic on such a vast scale under our noses? Archmage Modera, please allow the Vizier to finish his explanation, said Crossus, sounding grave. Krivax felt more than a little relieved that the dragon was already taking this seriously. It was likely that the dragon was already reaching the conclusion that Krivax wanted him to. Crossus was aware of both Deathwing and the Void's natural ability to manipulate the minds of people. Couple that with the extremely suspicious fact that nobody at all sent help for Stormwind, it wasn't exactly a difficult conclusion to reach. Thank you, Archmage Crossus, said Krivax. As I was saying, Stormwind has managed to gather circumstantial evidence that Lord Davil Prester is responsible for manipulating the minds of nobles in Lordaeron through the use of magic. They have also gathered evidence that House Prester has been making deals to undermine both Stormwind and Azrael Nerub. The conversation grew quiet once again as the Council of Six considered the seriousness of his claims. Krivax could tell that they did not believe his claims, but their relationship with Azrael Nerub was too important for them to risk harming relations by dismissing him out of hand. Tell me everything that you know about this situation, and present your evidence, said Antonidas firmly. Krivax did so gladly. It took him a while, but Krivax did not hesitate to share every little bit of evidence that Stormwind had managed to gather. The evidence about mental manipulations was not as strong as Krivax would have wished them to be, but House Prester's mundane crimes were already sufficient to implicate them. In the end, it didn't really matter if the evidence was enough to convince the entire Council of Six. As long as Crossus was able to read between the lines, then it was mission accomplished as far as Krivax was concerned. Once he was done laying everything out to the council, it was surprisingly Prince Kael'thas who was the first to speak. I must admit, while none of your evidence is very convincing on its own, it does become fairly compelling once you look at it from a broader point of view. What? How could you say that? Archmage Modera asked her fellow council member in surprise. After hearing the evidence, I agree that there is likely some malicious group that is targeting both Stormwind and Azrael Nerub, but they barely have any evidence that there is magic involved in this matter. This is not the first time that I've found myself suspicious about how Stormwind fell without any of us knowing about it, Kael'thas calmly explained. Malicious action by a powerful organization would explain how this happened under our aegis. In that context, the evidence that Vizier Krivax has presented is enough to convince me that House Prester is deeply suspicious and is worthy of investigation. A proper investigation would take much of our already limited time, said Antonidas. We must be certain this is warranted before we make such a commitment. Krivax stayed quiet as the Council of Six argued the merits of investigating House Prester amongst each other, focusing most of his attention on Crossus. He was sure that the dragon should have already connected Davil Prester to Deathwing, but he was beginning to grow nervous as Crossus maintained his silence. Krivax was in the middle of answering a question asked by Archmage Modera about the evidence when Crossus finally decided to speak up. I believe that we should launch a full investigation of Lord Davil Prester. After a moment of silence, Antonidas was the first to respond. Why do you believe we should do that, Archmage Crossus? I largely agree with Prince Kael'thas. The events that took place around Stormwind make no sense, said Crossus. Not only that, but has anybody asked why any organization would choose to target both Stormwind and Azrael Nerub? The only reasonable explanation is that they are trying to aid the Horde. Regardless of whether or not magic is involved in this matter, it would be foolish to ignore the dagger that is about to be buried into our backs. Krivax felt a growing sense of satisfaction as the conversation gradually turned in his favor. Croesus had obviously noticed the clues that had been prepared for him and was now turning his attention to Davil Presta. Once he knew for certain that Davil Presta was the human identity of Deathwing, the only remaining problem would be finding the dragon's soul. It would be difficult, but there were a limited number of places where Deathwing could logically keep it. After that happened, Krivax was certain that Croesus and the other aspects would be able to put together a plan to deal with Deathwing. He couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. Krivax was in the middle of daydreaming about dragons fixing all of his problems and ending the war with the Horde in a single day when he realized that Croesus was asking him a question. "I apologize, Archmage Croesus, could you repeat your question?" "I was asking whether or not Azrael, Nerub and Stormwind were doing anything further to investigate Lord Presta," said Croesus. I guess he's probably worried about someone tipping off Deathwing." Truthfully, Krivax had been a bit worried about the same thing after Hadix had informed him of his intent to look into Davil Presta. If Deathwing learned that his human disguise was already so heavily suspected, then nothing good would come of it. Krivax had also grown quite fond of his curmudgeonly mentor and didn't want him to get squashed like a spider being stepped on by a dragon. He had been slightly reassured when Hadix informed him that he didn't intend to confront Presta directly and would instead investigate discreetly. Hadix had been doing stuff like this for centuries, so Krivax was sure that he knew what he was doing. Krivax quickly told Croesus that his teacher was looking into House Presta carefully, not that it seemed to reassure him. "I do hope that he isn't caught," Croesus said worriedly, unknowingly echoing Krivax's own thoughts. "If House Presta is indeed responsible for everything that you claim they are responsible for, then they are extremely powerful and dangerous. This matter is one that needs to be handled with delicacy." "We understand that, Archmage. Azrael Nerub will not do anything that lets Presta know that he's under suspicion," said Krivax. "I'm glad to hear that," said Croesus, still not sounding assured. Croesus turned his attention back to the ongoing conversation and Krivax allowed his thoughts to drift to worrying about his mentor. He really hoped that Hadix wouldn't end up making him a liar. Hadix glared balefully at House Presta's ancestral home and knew instantly that he was in the right place. The building was completely covered in a dense weave of protective spells that was extremely out of place considering Presta's supposed level of wealth. They were so dense and complicated that the vast majority of viziers would have absolutely no hope of entering the building undetected. Even he, who was more capable than most at sneaking past magical defenses, would not be able to get in easily. According to information provided by Stormwind, Davil Presta should be handling business in Alteruk, and the man's goblin servant should be away from the manor as well. Despite having several children, none of them were known to live in the Presta's family manor, so it should currently be completely empty. It was a strange thing for a human noble to have only one servant, but it was obvious to Hadix that Presta was not a normal noble. Still, he would have expected the building to be busier than it was. Void cultists had a tendency to congregate if they were not culled quickly enough. Knowing that he would not receive any answers from glaring at the building, Hadix began to carefully weave a path through the wards. It was a time-intensive task. He would dismantle the wards completely, but he could not afford to leave behind any indication of his intrusion. Void cultists were easiest to deal with when they did not know that they were being hunted. Hadix had every intention of learning everything that he could about his enemy before he exterminated them. With a hum of pleasure, Hadix stabilized the path through the first layer of magical defenses and immediately began working on the rest. Every new spell was more complex and lethal than the last, and Hadix began feeling impressed by the skill of his target. "These humans are truly more capable than I had given them credit for," Hadix grudgingly admitted. "How is it that they managed to learn so much in so little time?" Hadix eventually succeeded in getting through the final layer of external wards. He was certain that there would be more inside the manor, but he would need to go inside to find out. Of course, he had no intention of actually entering the building with his own body when he didn't need to. With practiced ease, Hadix cast the spell to send his mind into the flyer that he had brought with him. Not only was using a flyer much safer than risking his own body, but Hadix had found over the years that many mages created wards that did not work on them. He could not recall the number of times that he had been confronted with a complex alarm ward, only to discover that the casting mage had created an exception for animals to prevent false alarms. Hadix didn't hesitate to send the flyer over the tall walls that surrounded the manor. Once past the walls, he was immediately confronted with a rather simple alarm spell, much more simple than he would have expected. Attempting to lure me into a false sense of security. If so, then their efforts were doomed to failure. Hadix had not lived as long as he had by being uncautious. It would take something truly exceptional to surprise him. Hadix directed the flyer through an opening that would allow it access to the building, only to immediately be confronted by the most potent source of void that he had felt in centuries. Forcing down his discomfort, Hadix carefully inspected the deadly void spell that was set to protect the interior of the manor from any intruders. It was easily one of the most dangerous and sophisticated examples of void magic that he had ever seen. With morbid curiosity, Hadix took a calming breath and began to use his extensive experience to analyze the spell's structure. It seems like this spell was created specifically to kill mages. I can tell that almost any counterspell would quickly have its magic devoured and absorbed. The spell has a tracking component, so fleeing would be useless. It would even have followed me through my link to the flyer. The more Hadix looked at the spell, the more uncomfortable he became. He could already tell that if he had walked into this spell unaware, then he would have died a painful death. It doesn't seem to have an alarm function, but the caster would be able to tell that it was triggered once they returned to it. The trigger seems set to go off by proximity. However, there does seem to be something more complex about this spell that I'm not seeing. After a few moments, Hadix realized what he was missing and immediately tried to sever his connection to the flyer. Unfortunately, it was too late. The flyer was dead faster than Hadix could react. The last thing it saw was a maw filled with razor-sharp teeth manifesting beside it and spewing out black tentacles from its depths. Now that same maw was manifesting from thin air next to Hadix, and he was already running away and beginning to cast the only spell he knew that might save his life. The void, however, had no intention of allowing him to live long enough to finish casting that spell. Hadix hurriedly reached into his spatial bag and threw out one of his most powerful defense artifacts at the tentacle that was reaching for him. The artifact activated and instantly created a powerful arcane barrier around Hadix without him needing to cast anything. The force that resulted when the tentacle slammed into it was enough to stagger him, but Hadix did not allow his casting to interrupt for even a second. He knew that if he did, then he would not be able to survive. It only took 2 more hits for the barrier to be shattered, the arcane magic making it up swiftly devoured. A moment before Hadix was able to finish casting his spell, the tentacle wrapped itself around one of his lower arms and one of his legs, tearing them off with ease. All of his defensive spells were rendered completely useless as the spell seemed to devour the magic sustaining them with its mere touch. It was only thanks to the fact that Hadix habitually used magic to ignore his own pain during a fight that he was able to prevent himself from screaming and instead finish his spell. Just as the tentacles were about to finish him off, Hadix opened his mouth and let forth a stream of violet, iridescent webbing that surrounded the tentacles and the maw that it came from. Hadix could feel his mana reserves being quickly depleted, but he could already tell that his spell was working. While the spell in Presta Manor was designed to use the void to devour magic in general, his spell used arcane magic to suppress the void. The maw thrashed wildly against the webbing that surrounded it, but it failed to escape no matter how hard it tried. Eventually, it stopped moving and Hadix was able to tell that the spell had been successfully suppressed. Hadix slumped over in relief, careful not to allow himself to become unbalanced due to his missing leg. I have to move quickly. Hadix reached into his spatial bag and quickly retrieved a potent healing elixir derived from troll blood. It would not be enough to regrow his limbs, but it would give him enough time to finish his business. Once that was done, Hadix summoned every drop of resolve he could for what came next. The void energies that he had sensed from the spell that almost killed him were by far the most potent that Hadix had sensed in his life. Whoever created it was a threat that could not be permitted to exist. He absolutely could not allow his own failure here to jeopardize that by letting them know that they were being investigated. Fortunately, the only spell that had been triggered was the Void spell, which did not have an alarm. Unfortunately, Presta would realize what had happened as soon as he returned. Haedix only hesitated for a moment before he turned his attention to the still suppressed Void spell. It had triggered before because there was a portion of it that was capable of sensing those that were paying it extended attention. Haedix could feel that it wanted to continue attacking him, but there was no risk of it doing so as long as he was keeping it suppressed. I'm starting to feel dizzy. I have to act soon. Tightly locking away the intense disgust he felt at doing so, Haedix delved into the memories of the time that he spent with his mentor, Elder Yelrin. Most of the lessons that Yelrin had taught him were horrific, but Haedix had no choice but to make use of them in this instance. Memories of a time when he was young and naive, and had taken far too long to see the truth of the elder who had promised to teach him secrets most viziers could only dream of. The spell that had nearly killed him was far too complex a creation for Haedix to replicate with the Void. However, he did not need to replicate it. He simply needed to restore it to its prior state before it had been triggered, which was just barely within his capabilities. Haedix let out a shuddering breath and focused on channeling the Void. Immediately, he could feel his body attempting to reject the foul magic. He was well acclimated to arcane magic, so channeling other kinds of magic was not a simple task. It took Haedix nearly 10 minutes for him to return the spell to the state in which he had found it. 10 excruciating minutes where the pain of his missing limbs grew by the moment and the whispers grew ever louder. As soon as he was finished, Haedix immediately closed the gaps he had made in the outer wards and searched his surroundings to make certain that nothing was out of place. Thankfully, it seemed like the maw had devoured his limbs whole, so he didn't need to worry about any traces of blood. Finally, once he was as certain as he could be that his attempted intrusion would not be discovered, Haedix used the last dregs of his magic to teleport himself to his student's room in Capital City. If he had possessed the strength to do so, then Haedix might have actually laughed at the look on Krivax's face when he appeared in his room missing an arm and a leg. Stop worrying, brat. It's not like it's the first time I've ever lost a limb. This is merely the price of overconfidence. As it was, Haedix didn't have the strength to do anything aside from passing out on the floor. As the world faded to black, he couldn't help but notice the oily whispers that vaguely sounded like his old master beginning to become audible in the back of his mind. Oh. The whispers are back. Those aren't going to go away for months, are they? Are you ever going to stop fussing, brat? Vizier Haedix, I don't think bringing you your potions could be considered as fussing, Krivax said in exasperation. I'm perfectly capable of getting them myself. I could teleport to and from the Queen's Cavern 6 times in the time it takes you to walk there. Well, I suppose it's a good thing that you don't have to, Krivax calmly responded while placing the aforementioned potions down on a table next to Haedix's web hammock. Krivax normally wouldn't feel comfortable rebuffing Haedix so casually, but his mentor had been acting uncharacteristically distracted over the past week. Glancing at the older vizier when he failed to respond, Krivax noticed that Haedix was once again lost in thought and staring off into space. It was something that had been happening frequently ever since Haedix had gotten pulled apart by one of Deathwing's traps. Krivax felt his mood sour as he recalled the events that happened just a week ago. It was only now that Krivax realized that he had built Haedix up to be some kind of indomitable figure in his mind. The vizier was a skilled and ancient wizard who had always seemed able to handle everything that came his way. Even if Krivax had known intellectually that Deathwing was far outside of his weight class, he'd never truly considered the possibility that Haedix would be so heavily injured by some preset defenses. He could still remember the panic that he had felt when Haedix had suddenly teleported into his room, bleeding heavily from his missing limbs. After he simply collapsed onto the floor without saying anything, Krivax had even thought that the vizier might be dead. Krivax felt a hint of shame when he remembered how long he had stood there in frozen shock. His slow reaction could have very nearly cost Haedix his life. It was only after he felt the growing pool of blood touching his feet that Krivax had pulled himself out of his stupor and sprung into action. The first thing that he had done was send Masruk to bring a healer from the Church of the Holy Light as discreetly as possible. Krivax was extremely glad that Azrael Nerub had a decent relationship with the church thanks to Anuba Khan, because they had not hesitated to do so. The second thing that he had done was inform Vizier Krenis and Archmage Runeweaver of the situation. The first was because she was nominally his superior, and the latter because he needed the Kirin Tor's help to keep the issue quiet. Krivax had not had any idea at the time how much Deathwing had known about Hadix's attempt to investigate his manor, or how bad things would get if everyone knew about the Vizier's injuries. Given those circumstances, Krivax had felt that it was best to err on the side of caution. So it was that Hadix's injuries were tended to. They all secretly went to the safety of the Nerubian enclave in Dalaran, and his teacher started to receive further treatment. Still, Krivax knew that this event likely sent shockwaves through both Azrael Nerub and the Kirin Tor. A diplomat, especially one as powerful as Hadix, being injured by a human noble was no small matter. The only thing stopping it from turning into a gigantic political shitstorm was the need for secrecy. After waking and hearing about how Krivax had handled things, Hadix had given him rare praise for performing well and clear-minded during an emergency, but Krivax did not feel any pride. Not when he had known the danger that the Vizier had been walking into and failed to say anything. Not when he still couldn't bring himself to say anything, even after the fact. It felt like every time that Krivax considered sharing what he knew, his mind turned to the worst possible outcomes. "What nonsensical thoughts are going through that head of yours, Krivax?" asked Vizier Hadix, pulling him from his thoughts. Krivax turned his attention back to the Vizier and was relieved to see that he had finished drinking all of the potions. Most of the potions did normal things like dulling pain or protecting him from infections, but two of them were a bit more esoteric. One of them was provided by the Order and was used by Hadix to clean his wounds of the void. There was absolutely no sign that Hadix was suffering from any kind of magical infection, but the Vizier refused to take any chances. The other was from a series of potions that Hadix would need to take over the course of several weeks. These potions would prepare his body for the magical ritual that would regrow his limbs. While these potions were rather miraculous, they had the unfortunate side effect of making Hadix too tired to do much. Predictably, the Vizier despised being seen as helpless and was not the most pleasant of patients. "I'm just thinking about how we're going to move on from here," Krivax lied. "The situation is more than a little complicated. Obviously, the Order will need to do everything in its power to destroy the creature wearing the skin of Davil Presta," said Hadix, his tone grim. One of the first things that Vizier Hadix had done after waking up was contact the Order and tell them about what had happened. He wanted them to immediately put together a kill squad composed of all their most powerful members, but something like that would take time if it ever happened. "Do you think that they'll be able to move quickly enough?" asked Krivax. "Didn't you say that the Order hasn't been able to send people to the Eastern Kingdom because the High King is watching them too closely? If Davil Presta is as powerful as you say he is, it doesn't seem likely that the Order will be able to organize a team to confront him anytime soon." Hadix took a moment to quietly consider the matter before he responded with a voice full of conviction. "Even if we are forced to rely on the aid of the Kirin Tor, we must do everything we can to see it dead. There's no telling what kind of damage such a powerful creature could do if left to its own devices." "Oh, I think I can imagine it just fine." A lull grew in the conversation as both Hadix and Krivax both found themselves considering the severity of the situation, until the silence was suddenly broken when Hadix decided to address the elephant in the room. "Are truly you not going to ask, brat?" "Do you truly want me to ask, Vizier Hadix?" asked Krivax, studying his mentor's expression. Vizier Hadix had not tried to hide that he had personally used the void during his investigation at Deathwing's manor. Even if he wanted to, Hadix had already taught Krivax how to sense the void well enough that he could faintly sense it in his mentor. Krivax had not made a big deal about it due to Hadix's injuries, but it wasn't exactly something that they could avoid talking about forever. I thought that I had properly explained to you how dangerous the void was. You should have demanded an explanation from me the moment that I told you. Well, all right then. Since Hades seemed to want to talk about it now, Krivax decided that it would be best to just address the matter directly. Why do you know how to use the void? Does the Order know that you can use it? Of course they do, said Hades, scoffing. They are the ones who rescued me from the insane fool that taught me how to use it in the first place. Who taught you? Krivax asked curiously. Hades assessed him for several moments before responding. This is not normally information that I would share, but I believe it is a story that you need to hear. The Void's influence in the Eastern Kingdoms is far more powerful than I imagined, and you need to understand how subtle and corruptive it can be. I understand, Vizier, Krivax said solemnly. Hades nodded at him before he began telling his story in a voice that was too neutral to not be forced. Much like you, I was recognized to be exceptionally talented at learning magic, and managed to catch the attention of a powerful vizier who wished to take me on as an apprentice. His name was Elder Yelrin, and he was the leader of the Lost Knowledge Research Division, and he was one of the most knowledgeable and influential viziers in the capital. As he spoke about his old mentor, Krivax felt like he could hear a bit of melancholy creep into Hades's voice. Elder Yelrin was a vizier who was extremely dedicated to the acquisition and spreading of knowledge. Where many viziers might have chosen to hoard their knowledge, Elder Yelrin did not hesitate to teach me everything that he knew, said Hades, his gaze distant as he recalled old memories. Without him, I can confidently say that I would not have grown to become half the mage that I did. He freely taught me magic that most mages had never even heard of. I grew to admire him more than any other vizier in the kingdom. Despite his words, Krivax couldn't see anything resembling admiration in the vizier's expression. He already had a good idea about where this story was headed. One day, Elder Yelrin informed me that the Lost Knowledge Research Division had unearthed a network of ancient tunnels that predated the Sundering. He said that he was excited to teach me a new form of magic that he had discovered while studying artifacts that were discovered inside, and that he needed my help to learn more about it. Why didn't the Order stop him? Asked Krivax. I'm sure they must have known that tunnels from before the Sundering would be dangerous. Hades shook his head, more somber than Krivax had ever seen him. The Order naturally monitors such old tunnels and the artifacts that come from them, but Elder Yelrin was extremely influential at that time. It was not difficult for him to secretly acquire what he needed without anyone knowing. The Order did not realize what was happening until long after the first sacrifices. Sacrifices? Yes. Artifacts were not the only thing that Elder Yelrin found in those tunnels. At the lowest part of those tunnels was some kind of creature. Even so many centuries later, I still do not know how to describe it, said Hades. It felt as if it had been birthed from the void itself. Until just a week ago, I had never again felt anything so utterly malevolent. Krivax shuddered at the description. It was likely that Hades was talking about Anraki, or Faceless Ones, a race of eldritch creatures that had been created by the old gods. Whatever it was, it offered knowledge to Elder Yelrin in exchange for either sacrifices or followers, a task that he was entirely too successful at accomplishing, said Hades, his voice returning to its forced neutrality. I learned how to harness the void from said knowledge, fractionally at least, but despite my misgivings about using it and the effect it had on me at the time, I trusted my teacher above all else. Eventually, the Order learned the truth of what was happening and decided to approach me. I did not believe them, and I foolishly decided to personally confront Elder Yelrin. Krivax experienced a quick burst of sympathy for Hades. It was extremely obvious that such a confrontation could not have ended well. I learned that not only were the Order's claims true, but the creature had also told Elder Yelrin how to find more of its kind. I do not wish to share the details, but suffice to say he and I came into conflict and I was the only one to survive. Krivax remained quiet, unsure of what to say. After that, the Order recruited me into their ranks, managed to kill the creature, and acquit me of any wrongdoing, said Hades, his gaze losing the unfocused luster that they had taken on throughout the story and focusing on Krivax. I had not used the void since, locking away its tempting whispers behind centuries of arcane discipline and self-control. Until recently. I tell you this because you must understand how capable that void is at twisting people into monsters. The moment that you sensed it in me, you should have begun keeping your distance. Krivax continued to remain silent as he considered what he had heard. It was an awful story that exhibited the kind of horrible things that could happen in Azeroth, but he was not actually as naive as Hadix believed. If anything, the story just made him glad that had not been forced to go through anything similar. I will take your words to heart, Krivax said earnestly. But I genuinely don't believe that you are anything like Elder Yelrin. That fact that you've been able to resist the Void's temptations for so long is proof enough for me. Vizier Hadix stared at him for several moments before scoffing and leaning back in his hammock. One day, your soft heart is going to get you into trouble, Krivax. You're entirely too trusting. Despite the rebuking words, Krivax felt like he could hear a faint fondness in his mentor's voice. Oh, Vizier Hadix. If only you knew how wrong you were. Trust was not something that he'd ever had an abundance of. After that, the two of them discussed the Kirin tour and their ongoing investigation into Davil Presta for several minutes before Hadix grew tired and Krivax decided to leave the room. As soon as he left, Krivax was confronted with the figure of Masruk as his friend followed him back to his room. "Are you okay?" asked Masruk as soon as they were alone. They both knew that the past few days had not exactly been the easiest on Krivax. "No, not really," said Krivax, not elaborating further as he slumped over in exhaustion. "Is it anything that you can talk about?" Krivax wondered how he should respond to that. Should he just say, "Hey, this world is super terrifying," or "I'm scared that I've made everything worse and we're all about to be killed by an insane dragon"? After he realized that he wouldn't be receiving a response, Masruk merely nodded in acceptance. "Even if I'm not as smart as you, I'm not an idiot. I know that you and Vizier Hadix are doing things that you can't tell me about. Things that are important and weigh on you heavily." That didn't surprise Krivax at all. Masruk had been there on more than one occasion when Krivax was covering for a missing Hadix. Not only that, but Hadix had not been shy about kicking Masruk out of a room whenever he wanted to speak with Krivax about something related to the Void. Yet throughout it all Masruk never argued or complained, he simply did his duty with the same stoicism that he had possessed since they were just hatchlings. Masruk simply supported him all the while like the true friend he was. And it always made Krivax feel both grateful and guilty to have him in his corner. "If you cannot tell me more, then I will not ask. I only wish to tell you one thing. If you are ever in danger and need my help, you will have my support." Krivax looked over to Masruk and was immediately able to tell what he was thinking. It was obvious that his friend was worried that Krivax would end up bleeding out on the ground like Hadix without having any way to know the cause. As both a guard and a warrior, this must be something that grated heavily on his instincts. "Thank you, Masruk. I don't deserve a friend like you," said Krivax, suddenly filled with emotion. Masruk shook his head in denial. "You might not see it, but you've done more to change my life than anyone else, Krivax. If not for you, I'd probably be just another warrior in Killercook, and would have never gotten the chance to see all that I have. And for that, you have my eternal thanks. Maybe the ignorance would have been better." Masruk, I think that, anything that Krivax was even thinking about saying was cut off as his magical senses felt something suddenly reach out, grab him, and bypass all of his passive defenses as if they did not even exist. The last thing he saw was Masruk's shocked expression and outstretched hand before he vanished in a flash of light. The mood in the Chamber of Air was grim as the Council of Six listened to the report being made by Archmage Rune Weaver on the ongoing investigation into Lord Davil Presta. Ever since Vizier Hadix had been grievously injured while attempting to investigate the noble's manor, the Council had been taking the matter far more seriously. Most of them recognized the Vizier as someone who likely held the skill of an Archmage, so the fact that he had been injured was no small matter. They were all extremely fortunate that they had been successful in keeping the affair under wraps and that it had not escalated into a diplomatic incident. Croesus found his thoughts wandering to the events that brought them here. He had been at his home while having a conversation with Lord Malygos through a scrying spell about their efforts to locate the dragon's soul when he suddenly received a summons from the Council of Six. Once they all gathered, Croesus quickly learned that Vizier Haedix had been severely injured during his investigation, teleported to his student's room in Capital City while missing several limbs, and immediately passed out on the floor. Apparently, Krivax decided to ask Archmage Runeweaver to assist him in discreetly transporting the injured vizier to the Nerubian enclave in Dalaran and keeping the matter quiet. Runeweaver immediately agreed to help and then used his authority as a member of the Council of Six to teleport Vizier Haedix through the city's wards and brought him to the enclave. There had been a bit of discussion on whether or not Haedix should be sent to Ankilla to receive medical attention or if the Nerubians would send a queen to the city's enclave, but they eventually settled on the latter option. To think that the Nerubian queens could even regrow limbs with their magic. Although it would take a significant amount of time for Vizier Haedix to regain his limbs, it didn't take long for him to wake up after receiving medical treatment. It was only then that Archmage Runeweaver learned the full story and then called for an emergency meeting of the Council of Six. On that day, Croesus became as certain as he could reasonably be that Davil Prester was Deathwing. The Council of Six decided to make their investigation into Prester their top priority, and Croesus immediately reported the news to the Aspects. It took some time, but the Aspects had eventually agreed on a plan for how they intended to deal with Deathwing, one that filled Croesus with a strange mix of anticipation and uneasiness. Between the two groups, his recent days had been filled with many extremely important meetings, such as the one he was currently attending. Despite their busy schedules, the Council of Six had decided to meet within the Chamber of Air rather than holding the meeting over a scrying spell. As a result of our investigations, I believe we can determine that Lord Davil Prester is very likely to be a powerful wielder of magic, said Archmage Runeweaver, pulling Croesus' attention back to the present. How so, Archmage Runeweaver? Asked Prince Kael'thas, leaning forward in his seat. I believe it is reasonable to reach this conclusion, simply on the fact that any attempt to study him through magic has failed to reveal anything, said Archmage Runeweaver. House Prester was ostensibly a small family of no significant renown, so there was really no reasonable explanation for why they could not scry Lord Prester. While it is true that he could possess some kind of powerful anti-divination artifact, even that would be extremely suspicious. Even if it's unlikely, it's still a possibility, said Archmage Modera, although she sounded as if she didn't believe it herself. None of Croesus' colleagues were taking the news of this matter very well. If Davil Prester was truly a powerful magic user, then that lent credibility to the rest of the claims made by Vizier Krivax. If there was an organization that had used magic to prevent Stormwind from receiving aid against the Horde, then the Kirin Tor had failed in their duties in a catastrophic fashion. The kingdoms had always trusted Dalaran to protect them from rogue wizards, but it was looking more likely that their trust had been misplaced. As far as Croesus knew, Archmage Modera in particular had once had family in Stormwind. The wards on Prester Manor are as powerful as Vizier Haedix has claimed, Antonidas said grimly. Despite my best efforts, I was unable to see past the outermost layer. Even if Lord Prester might possess some manner of artifact protecting him from magical observation, the wards on his manor are enough evidence that he is at least affiliated with an extremely powerful mage. The rest of the council grew silent at the Grand Magus' words. If the Grand Magus was referring to a mage as extremely powerful, then it was clear to everyone gathered that they had stumbled onto something big. If only they knew what they were up against. Although, I suppose they won't remain ignorant for much longer. How are we going to handle this? Asked Kel'Thuzad. He always was one to prefer action over words. Lord Prester must be confronted. We cannot afford to ignore such a dangerous enemy in our midst while we are at war, Croesus said truthfully. As far as he was concerned, Deathwing was by far a more significant threat than the Horde, and the Council of Six would need to help in dealing with him. It's not easy to form a strategy against an enemy with unknown capabilities, said Prince Kael'thas. "We do not have the time to conduct a full investigation," Antonidas said firmly. It went without saying that such an investigation would risk any one of them being grievously wounded or killed, if Vizier Hadix was an example. No matter how powerful this Lord Prester might be, I sincerely doubt that he could stand up to the might of multiple archmages. Crossus looked around and saw that everyone seemed to be in agreement with the Grand Magus. All of them were extremely powerful individuals, so it was difficult for the archmages to believe that there could be a threat that they could not handle. "You would be mistaken, mortal." Just as the council was about to begin discussing some kind of plan to attack Prester, they were suddenly interrupted by an unfamiliar voice. Dramatic as always. Crossus watched in exasperation as a portal opened in the center of the chamber of air. He must have greatly underestimated how tense the war had made his colleagues, because more than half of them were already throwing spells the moment an elf-shaped figure walked through the portal. Archmage Modera summoned a half-dozen water elementals throughout the chamber. Runeweaver instantly created a swirling firestorm around the intruder, and Kel'Thuzad attempted to activate the chamber's defensive wards. If they understood who they were facing, then they would have known that attempting to harm Lord Malygos with magic was far beyond the abilities of any mortal, no matter how skilled and accomplished. With a wave of his hand, the aspect of magic simultaneously counter-spelled each of the Archmage's spells. The elementals disappeared as quickly as they had appeared, the firestorm fizzled out of existence while leaving behind nothing but smoke, and Kel'Thuzad suffered a magical backlash as his connection to the wards was severed. While that alone was enough to raise the perceived threat of Lord Malygos among the council, Crossus knew that the aspect could have done much worse. The smoke left behind by Runeweaver's firestorm quickly began to clear, and the mortals were able to get their first look at Lord Malygos' mortal form. Like many of the aspects, his preferred mortal guise possessed distinct features that made it obvious that he was more than he seemed. Lord Malygos took the form of a regal blue-haired high elf with brightly glowing eyes and spikes of ice protruding in a neat row along the sides of his jaw, as well as a row of horns that started at his forehead and disappeared into his hair. Crossus recalled that in the past Lord Malygos' mortal form looked more like a normal highborn, but had since changed it. Most likely due to his dislike of them after the War of the Ancients. "Who are you, intruder? How did you pass through the chamber's wards?" asked Antonidas, gripping his staff as oppressive waves of magic emanated from his body. "Be honored, mortals. You are the first of your kind to stand in my presence in 10 millennia, said Lord Malygos, stepping further into the chamber and closing the portal behind him. "I am Malygos, aspect of magic and leader of the Blue Dragonflight." Crossus held mixed feelings as he studied the reactions of his colleagues. A part of him had always felt a little guilty over hiding his true nature from the people who he otherwise trusted. It felt a bit surreal that the aspects had decided to involve themselves directly with the mortals, but they had reluctantly decided that this would be the best course of action. Combined with the evidence brought forward by Stormwind and Azrael Nerub, Vizier Hadix's injury was enough to convince the aspects that Daedal Prester was almost certainly the mortal guise of Deathwing. From there, they had immediately begun arguing about what they should do with this information. As long as Deathwing still had possession of the dragon soul, attacking him head-on would be a foolish endeavor. In order for the aspects to be able to confront Deathwing, the dragon soul would need to be located and retrieved by mortal hands. Otherwise, there would be an unacceptable risk that one of Deathwing's mortal servants would use it to take control of the other aspects. If that were to happen, then there would be no one in Azeroth who could even hope to stand against the corrupted aspect. The only problem was that they did not know with certainty where the dragon soul actually was. However, they did have a decent idea. Deathwing would by necessity need to keep the dragon soul in a well-guarded location that he could easily access. It would be useless if some mortal was to sneak off with it, or if it was too far away for Deathwing to actually use if he was ambushed. With that in mind, the Dragonflights had mobilized all of their mortal servants and were searching every location that they could think of. With Lady Ysera searching through mortal dreams for anyone who had seen the dragon soul and Lord Malygos using his arcane knowledge to search as well, Crossus had no doubt that they would eventually find it. You claim to be a dragon? Prince Kael'thas asked in surprise. Out of all the mortal races in the Eastern Kingdoms, his kind were the ones who knew the most about dragons. Did you not hear what I said, elf? I am far more than just a dragon, Lord Malygos said with an annoyed expression before calming down a moment later. Although I suppose I should not blame you mortals for not understanding the significance of my titles. Your ignorance is not truly your fault. Croesus barely held back a weary sigh. He really wished that Lord Malygos had not insisted on being the one to approach the Council of Six. Then please, educate us, Croesus said quickly before the conversation could devolve any further. He could already see most of the council was growing increasingly offended, aside from Kel'Thuzad, who was staring at Lord Malygos as if he wanted to peel him apart and learn his secrets. I'm sure we would all like to know why you are here. Lord Malygos huffed disdainfully before returning to the subject at hand. I've come to inform you all about a force that threatens not only you but all of Azeroth. This would not normally be something that concerns the mortal races, but due to certain circumstances we must work together if any of us wish to survive. The Council of Six was silent as they processed Lord Malygos' words. While they were skeptical, they had all seen his power firsthand and could not casually dismiss him. Even now the aspect of magic radiated more power than any of them had ever sensed in their life. What threat are you referring to? Antonidas asked after a moment of silence. Why does it threaten all of Azeroth, and why would someone as powerful as you need our aid? Good questions, but I am not fond of repeating myself, said Lord Malygos. This matter needs to be known by the Nerubians as well. We shall continue after I summon one of their representatives. Croesus could tell that the archmages were surprised, and he couldn't help but sympathize. He didn't trust the Nerubians anywhere near as much as he did his colleagues, especially when they were his prime suspects for who sent the anonymous letter. The only reason that Lord Malygos was insisting on their inclusion was that they needed as many powerful individuals as possible to help secure the Dragon Soul, and Azul-Nerub was a very powerful nation. It also helped that Lord Nasdormu had pushed for this course of action, and when the Master of Time decided to actually give advice about the future, it was wise to listen. Before anyone could object, Lord Malygos casually waved his hand and Vizier Krivax appeared next to him in a flash of bright violet light. Croesus was not an expert in Nerubian body language, but the way that the Vizier was frantically looking around made it clear that he was utterly bewildered. Well, that and the first thing that came out of his mouth. What the hell?